'cause you can't, you won't, and you don't stop. Or when you can't, you won't, and you don't stop. Might be coming down for sure.
So as I've stated a few times, I think one of the most important things you can get out of this subject is a way of thinking. And the reason for that is that the law requires the use of logic. And perhaps somewhat unusually, it requires the use of both inductive logic and deductive logic to understand fully what's going on. In life, we often do use logic. Most of the time, we use deduction explicitly. Implicitly, we might use induction, but we often don't recognize it. So I just wanted to go through the basic ideas behind these two different approaches to using logic and how they're used in the law. So as I was saying, legal and ethical thinking relies heavily on logic, both induction and deduction. Induction is where you have a series of arguments or claims that support a conclusion. So you draw an inference from the specific, something that you see, and come up with a general conclusion. So you look at something or a series of things and draw a theory out of that. That's induction. In contrast, deduction is where you have a chain of statements or arguments that link together. So to use deduction, you're going to have a general theory that you apply to a specific observation. It's quite a different approach to thinking. In induction, we're essentially looking for a pattern in the observations to draw out a theory. In deduction, we're imposing a rule on an observation that we have. So how does this relate to law? Well, if you want to understand common law rules and how those rules develop, lawyers often use induction, right? So what they do is they see a number of cases, particularly where the judges aren't terribly clear in their reasoning when they come up with a decision. So they'll look at a few decisions around the same issue, and from that they will draw out a general principle. Okay. Sometimes judges do it themselves when they sum up an area, but often it's the lawyer's job to look at these judgments and draw a general principle of law and its exceptions to apply. In contrast, once we have a rule of law, what we need to do is to use deduction to apply it. Okay, so we've got to understand the observation and then apply the rule to the observation. So law uses both induction and deduction. So a couple of examples might help us understand this particular difference. Why don't we have a look at these? So in the first one, we've got this idea, these two statements, right? All French people like champagne. Marion is French, therefore Marion likes champagne. Right? So what we have is a general rule, right? French people like champagne. Then what we have is a specific observation. Marion is French, therefore she likes champagne. Okay. Look at this second one though. Wen likes to fight. All the people I know who fight have confidence, therefore Wen has confidence. Okay. This is a different logic. It doesn't say all people who fight have confidence. It says all the people I know. So that's repeated observation, and we're grouping Wen into that. Therefore, it's an induction. Right? We're using induction based upon observations rather than the rule. How about this last one? Khatib cooks well, Zoe cooks well, therefore the people I know cook well. Induction or deduction? That's much more clearly induction, right? We have two observations and we're drawing a general theory. People I know cook well based upon two observations. Khatib cooks well and that Zoe cooks well. Okay, induction versus deduction. Different logics. You'll use both of them in business. And in fact, in business, we often use induction far more than deduction. So it's a very particular skill and it's one well worth mastering. So when it comes to business, mastering these skills requires us to question different things when we're facing a problem. Okay. So deduction is very strong in allowing us to draw a conclusion, provided the rule that we're using is accurate and correct. In contrast, deduction is not as strongly held, right? Because we're using pure observations to draw this inference out of. Okay, so if we want to test the thinking, we have to test the two different approaches to logic differently. For deduction, we basically want to test the premises or the general theory and say, is that general theory really true? In contrast, for induction, we want to test the conclusion. Can we come up with counter examples that test the actual argument? It's not as though one logic is better than the other. They just have different advantages and disadvantages. While induction allows us to draw a very strong conclusion and allows us to test theory, it really is suited more to very specific problems, and it's hard to use in everyday life because it requires the theory or the premise to be true. In contrast, induction is something that we can use in everyday life because we have partial knowledge and probabilities, and we're actually building a theory that we deal with. However, we're never sure that we're definitely true based upon the logic of the thinking. We need to test those counterexamples to understand how robust our thinking is. Legal thinking requires both deduction and induction. When applying the law, we think inductively. We're given the law, a proposition, then we identify the relevant facts from the situation, that's our second proposition, and then we draw a conclusion. Doesn't matter whether it's case law or statute, that's the approach we take. So for instance, if a legal agreement requires an offer and acceptance, and you offer to buy my computer and I accept, then because we got proposition 1, the rule, and proposition 2, our observation, we will find that you and I have a legal agreement. However, if we've got a case and we need to work out what the rule is, often we will rely on inductive thinking. We're grouping similar decisions together to work out a general principle. So, if case A says work you have already completed is not good consideration, and case B says paying in the past for a meal someone had in the past is not good consideration, then we conclude the general principle is that legally, past consideration is not good consideration. Okay, we use those two specific instances, two types of consideration to draw a general rule. In business and in life, good thinking requires the use of both induction and deduction. We spend a lot of our time in business thinking and working problems out inductively, even if we don't recognize it. We're looking for these patterns on which to draw like a general law that's going to inform our behavior into the future. Really importantly, understanding whether you're using induction or deduction can be really important because it helps you understand what do you want to test. Do you want to test the general rule, or do you actually have to look for counterfactuals in the conclusion? And we know that what we are going to do, what we need to do to test the robustness varies by the kind of logic that we're actually using. Okay, so that's logic in the law, well, very briefly. And now what we're going to do is show how we use a part of that logic, particularly deduction, in order to structure an answer that we might come across in our assessment for the next part of the course.